I'm the Dean of the College of Business Administration here at LMU, and it's truly my honor to offer you a welcome. I got to tell you, last night it was St. Patrick's Day, and I was at the Irish Consulate at a wonderful event talking about foreign direct investment, and you may be wondering, what does that have to do with biodiversity? But I heard from their Minister of, let me get his title right, the Minister of Environment, Climate, and Energy. And the way he talked about these issues really brought to life. By the way, there was not a word mentioned about tariffs. I just want to tell you that. What was so interesting about the event last night was the way they talked about things that really align with who we are as an institution. And when we think about ourselves being a Catholic Jesuit institution and the importance of the care for our common home, it's the topics that we'll be addressing tonight on global sustainability that really make a difference. What is biodiversity? Why is it an important topic for all of us to think? And as we wish the Pope, good health, I'm always struck by his comments from the Laudato Si, where he talks about our responsibilities, regardless of our faith traditions, of being responsible for being responsible for our common home, the care for them. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce one of our professors, Young Sun Peck, who heads up our Center for International Business Education and Research, to introduce our distinguished panelists that come not just from the CBA, but from all over the university to really speak to these issues. And with that, I turn it over to Professor Peck.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. So I'm in charge of running the Center for International Business Education. So LMU, we were fortunate to have this center thanks to the grant that we received from the U.S. Department of Education. Although we're not sure about the future of this grant, but this is one of our major themes for the center. So as our dean mentioned, that global sustainability is more than environmental issues. I think that any company that integrate this biodiversity conscious strategy is more likely to become a winner in the global market. And one of the mandates of the cyber grant is to help U.S. businesses to become more competitive in the global market. So let me introduce our great panelists today. I'd like to start with Dr. Eric Strauss. He's over there. He's a president professor of biology and executive director of LMU Center for Urban Resilience. And his collaborative research includes animal behavior, endangered species management, urban ecosystems, and science education. He's the senior director of a web-based peer-reviewed journal called Cities and Environment. Our next panelist, sitting here, is Dr. Tyler Holland. He's an associate professor of urban and environmental studies at LMU. He studies governance and social environmental implication of energy transition in China and Southeast Asia. So he's a Woodrow Wilson Center China Fellow and Fulbright China Fellow. His research has been published in the China Quarterly, Global Environmental Change, and Annals of American Association of Geographers. And the next panelist, Dr. Lawrence Calvers, my colleague, the CBA, is a professor of the accounting, and he holds the Chad Dreyer Chair in Accounting Ethics. Since he joined the LMU in 2015, he served as an associate dean for faculty and academic programs in CBA from 2018 to 2023. And he also served as a chair of the accounting department from 2015 to 2019. His teaching as well as research interest covers areas of accounting, business ethics, auditing, and corporate governance. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator who will facilitate panel discussion, Dr. Jeff Peace. He's a clinical associate professor in the Department of Management at the CBA. He's also director of the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability. Prior to joining LMU as a full-time faculty member, Jeff's worked in the areas of applied ethics as a mission-integrated executive most recently serving as Vice President of the Leadership Institute for St. Joseph Health in Irvine, California. So,
Thank you. So it's really great. Thank you guys for being here tonight. Really honored to have this evening on biodiversity. This was born out of a collaboration, a long-standing collaboration that the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability has with our Faculty Advisory Committee. We seek partnership and collaboration to ground our work in the scholarship and in the focus of our faculty in, as Dean Smith said, in a transdisciplinary way. And you see all of the different centers and different initiatives throughout LMU really helping us understand the dimensions and the ramifications and really the inspiration that we need to feel and follow in caring for our common home. So we chose, again, in dialogue, this topic of biodiversity and really understanding ecosystems and the relevance and the leadership and the work that takes place in Los Angeles and as an inspiration for how we understand the importance and ongoing engagement with biodiversity. So the format for tonight will be that we will have 3 presentations, and then we'll have Q&A, and then we have a reception outside, okay? So, Dr. Strauss.
Thank you. For me, it's always a delight as a biologist to be invited to the College of Business Administration. I put on clean shoes, I don't have any feathers flying off of me, and so it's a delight to be here. I also teach in the entrepreneurial graduate program that you have as well, and it's incredible at LMU to think about how transdisciplinary we can be because we are thinking about shared problems. And as you know, the structure of the universities, we see it now with the current departments and colleges, that goes back hundreds of years. So we have to be able to come across boundaries to do that. And you're blessed to have a dean who sees that clearly and thinks about how important it is for us to work across the aisle, as it were. And so tonight, this is going to be a speed primer on the nature of biodiversity in urban systems and why biodiversity should matter to entrepreneurial students of business, because we understand how important the economy and commerce is in the context of where we live. And so we're going to talk about urban resilience through this idea of biodiversity. And this first image I have for you is from urban wild space in Culver City and in the wooded oil fields. And it's a surprisingly diverse community. We just finished a 3-year intensive study for this Culver City and helping them in their coyote management. But we did a biological study of what these coyotes do, what they eat, where they go, where they spend their time, and so forth. And part of what we use are these remote camera systems. And I particularly like this image. The cameras were up for years until we gathered over 2 million images. And it helps us to understand the structure of the system. Any parent will recognize this picture, and any teenager will recognize this picture. That's Dad, and he's giving the look to one of his kids. And you can see the ears flapping. I don't know what this guy did, but it wasn't good. And Dad's letting him know that that was not okay, and don't do it again. When we think about the urban context, when we think about how land has been transformed, there are over 30 different diverse ecosystems in California and over 8 right here in the Los Angeles area. And yet, when we put gray infrastructure on top, things change. We call those biogeosocial drivers. First of all, we change the hydrology because of dredging and dumping, levees, culverts, and so forth. We pave roads, we drain standing water, we alter the quality of that water through point source discharges and pollution and heavy metal impairments and pesticides. And then we also alter the habitat by fragmenting and cutting it up, by introducing invasive and non-native species. We have noise and light pollution, something we'll talk about in just a moment. And then, as our attempts to manage this, we introduce things like vector control, where we spray oil and pesticides to try and control insect populations, we make physical modifications. And all this is happening in the context of constant change. And that's a really important thing for us to remember, because we like to use words like sustainability and restoration, which gives us the illusion that there's a place back in history we can return to that will be better than where we are now. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about biodiversity. And biodiversity, our planet is so incredibly rich in life systems. It is unimaginable even to those of us who study the phenomenon. We've named 1.5 million species so far. Most of them are insect species, but we see lots of vertebrates and other organisms as well. We define diversity as the variety of life at every hierarchical and spatial scale. When you think biodiversity, you're probably thinking the number of species that are encountered in a particular habitat. But that's only one measure. We're measuring from individual changes in the molecular structure of genes in animals all the way up through the Earth on its larger scale. And so those of us who study biodiversity study this on multiple scales. And the different scales give us different information about how the system is doing. And each organism, each living organism, is a biological experiment and an ecological investment. Because in the context of a changing ecosystem, we cannot predict what will work in 1 million years, or even 100 years, or even 10 years. And so the variation we see in living systems is a safety net for us and for all living organisms, that this network of living systems, some call it Gaia, some call it holistic ecology, these interactions among the living organisms and the non-living environment that they're in, is this network that keeps life going. The universe has for a long time, in the force of science, been seen as a stable entity. And I like to blame Sir Isaac Newton for that. And you know, extraordinary contributions in the period of time. He was a Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge back in the early 1700s. By the way, the department structure is still the same now as it was back then, which is both good and part of the problem. And he invented things like calculus to understand the motion of the planets, built the first reflecting telescopes. He wrote the Principia, the President of the Royal Society, just a few things. Arguably, maybe the most important scientist ever in Western history. And therefore, what he says matters. And he had this incredible statement that he viewed the universe as a perfectly ordered machine. Would suggest, one, we can completely understand it, and two, that logical intervention in its works will ultimately lead to a complete understanding. He laid the groundwork of modern deductive science, and thank goodness he did that. But this desire for fixed outcomes, such as sustainability and restoration, leaves us always a little bit off in trying to sort the decisions we should be making, both as scientists and stakeholders and entrepreneurs. I argue that we should think resilience and transformation, recognizing these systems are in constant state of flux. Even though the human lifespan, and you're the first generation that's going to live to be 100 years old on a regular basis, sounds like a long time, but it's not. In the context of the way in which the Earth changes, the basic unit of time is about 1 million years. And really, for big things to happen, it's much larger than that. So I argue that one of the most important tools, lenses we can put on to help us understand the nature of biodiversity and its relationship to us, is through a concept called ecosystem services. And this is a system developed about 25 years ago that basically, if we put it on a bumper sticker, says, ecology, what have you done for us lately? It's a very powerful political tool because it casts all of living systems in its value to human survivorship, which you may argue is hubris, but in the context of governance, and you're trying to convince elected officials to do things that are good for the environment, it needs to boil down, it's also good for us. And so ecosystem services is a powerful tool. And naturally, healthy ecosystems purify air and water, they mitigate droughts and floods, they generate and preserve soils, detoxify waste, pollination of crops and vegetation, dispersal of seeds, cycling of nutrients, control the vast majority of pests and diseases. And so basically, when we can use an ecosystem service to solve a problem, it costs us a lot less, and it's renewable. And so almost all our technology is in some way a replication of a natural process. Next time you're going past Dockweiler Beach, look at and you go past the sewage treatment facility, they do 400 million gallons of water treatment a day. It comes in as raw sewage, it comes out as drinkable water. It's amazing. And you drive past and it's like there's dozens of these gigantic eggs. What's going on there? Those are biological digesters that work like really good soil, but are million-fold acceleration. It's all mimicking nature as we break down the compounds. So we don't live in the past, we live in the present, and the present is complicated. And so a new version, a new type of ecology has emerged called urban ecology, which brings together these transdisciplinary approaches to really understand the nature of biodiversity. And the theory is that social and environmental well-being are inextricably linked and in constant flux. What does this really mean? It means that resilient and livable cities are only possible if its human residents are healthy in their neighborhoods. And this includes a rapidly changing relationship with nature, embedded in a biodiverse landscape that's supporting these ecosystem services. So we can view this as a job for all living things to do, and to understand that job. And remember, that job might not be served by the same organism 100 years ago that's doing it now, because the climate's changed. And you might try to plant native plants that were there 100 years ago, but they won't grow in that landscape anymore because it's too hot or too dry. It's changed. But we can continue to maintain the ecosystem service that those organisms were providing. And there's a charter of Calcutta said in 1990, one of the cities with the biggest challenges of poverty in the world, we must cease seeing the city as the problem, we must see the city as the solution. Because in developed nations, 70% of the population lives in urban areas, and globally it's over 50%. And if we're going to have a home for 9 to 10 billion people on the planet, they need to be urban, because the resources per person goes down as you increase density. So let's talk about resilience for a moment. And resilience is linked very tightly to biodiversity. Resilience is recognizing that these systems are cyclic. And because it's a cycle, work of Charles Hollings and others have developed what we call the adaptive cycle, and as it relates to ecosystem resilience. Ecosystem resilience is the ability to absorb disturbances and continue to provide ecosystem services even if the physical structure changes, as it likely will. And so if we think about a particular system and reaches this version that we think of as stability, there's going to be change, and during that period of change, the model or the tradition is released, and there's all this innovation that happens. Through reorganization, we exploit that new resource and reach a new level of moderate stability for a period of time. Think about energy. First it was wood, then it was coal, then it was petroleum. And each time this happened, there were profound advances in technology and health and all these kind of responses in the human experience. And now we're in this period of inventing and implementing new forms of energy that, because of our ability to control forces and understand it better, can serve a larger number of people with less negative impacts on the planet. So these systems, any particular system that we're looking at, needs to be viewed in the resilience adaptive cycle. And of course, this is where CPA comes in, because these solutions are going to have to be invented and then paid for and then integrated and supported. There's tremendous opportunity when we think about the resilience of biodiversity and the adaptive cycle. So just as an example, for instance, and this is something people have been doing in their backyards, hummingbirds are doing very, very well in Los Angeles, believe it or not. but one native species has replaced another native species, and that's really okay. This is an Allen's hummingbird. Urbanization's changed the dynamics of these competing species. The populations of Allen's have increased, while Annas have receded, but the ecosystem services provided by hummingbirds is still taking place. And some of that is being helped by your feeders that you're putting out. Our lab has been studying hummingbirds for quite some time. And we're particularly interested in their energetics. This is a thermal camera at night of an incubating female who has to manage her heat to keep the eggs warm and at the same time not starve to death because their metabolism is so fast. So I promised Jeff I'd talk about Los Angeles, and we're going to finish up in the next 2 minutes. I'm actually on time, which surprises everybody. About 4 years ago, the city of Los Angeles, through their sanitation department, brought together organizations, universities, and agencies and assembled an expert council to provide guidance on developing tools for understanding the biodiversity of Los Angeles, and then using that understanding as a tool to transform governance and management and development and become an additional component to the overall regulatory framework of zoning and things like that that run the city. So the first biodiversity baseline index was published in 2022. I had the great joy of being on this guidance council and still am. We developed 25 key metrics to provide a framework to understand both the change and the impact of what interventions on biodiversity might do. And these metrics had a wide focus. A whole cluster around the health of native species, one on social equity considerations, and the third on governance. And that led to a local biodiversity strategy and action plan, which we hope will be implemented in Los Angeles soon. So when you go to do anything in Los Angeles, you want to build a house, you have to go through a series of permits. And you'll come in, and let's say you're building a house, and they'll check off the wiring, and they'll check off the gas, and they'll check off the water. We need a box for biodiversity. What are you doing on your land that probably won't cost you anymore, that'll make the decisions that'll enhance biodiversity so the resilience can be enhanced? I'm giving a talk on Thursday in Whittier about reimagining the landscapes that have burned after the fires, because we need to think differently not only about the construction of houses, but we need to think differently about the plants and the way that would create space for wind to move through these areas and so forth. It's not magic. It can be done. So here are some of the data. I'm just going to show you two very quickly because it's quite an extraordinary tool. And it's all online, and you can go and analyze it yourself and look at some of the data. So these are the natural patches of green that are in Los Angeles. The trick now is to find connections so that animals can move among these patches, which maintains the genetic diversity of those communities. And of course, one of those, what's happening is over the 101 freeway, the Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, which will be the widest and longest animal crossing in North America when it opens this spring. Extraordinary. And it's not just about large predators crossing. It's not just about mountain lions. It's about all kinds of vertebrate and invertebrate species that'll be able to link these two really important ecosystems that were cut by that 10-lane highway. Here's one you might not think of. This is the average radiance measure in Los Angeles. This is the amount of light at night. And one of the real problems in cities is that it doesn't get dark. It doesn't really get dark. And the circadian rhythms of humans are messed up, but the circadian rhythms of animals and plants are terribly disrupted. And so how do we move forward protecting these critical resource areas from being bombarded by too much light? And we now know that we have great experts here in Los Angeles who've done phenomenal work on the impact of light. We know how much light, and now, think about this. I want to leave you with this. We've transitioned from incandescent bulbs to LEDs. That's amazing. You use less energy, they produce more light for the amount of energy they use. But they're terrible for some species of insects because they're hyper attractive. But it turns out that the insects are only attracted to very narrow frequencies. We can actually tune our LED bulbs that take out the frequencies that drive insects crazy, and we won't notice the difference. See, technology in service to business and service to nature. It's possible to do it all. That's it. Now we're going to hand it over. Okay, great. Yeah.
Bear with me, everybody. Let's see if I can do this.
So it's already open and just minimized on the bottom. So
Just
you
minimized,
close
okay.
out.
Can I see?
No, that's fine.
Wait, I got a better idea. Window? No. There it is. This happened in my classroom the other day where the big TV was the only thing that was working and the monitor wasn't, and I was doing this all class long, and it was a little rough. Okay. Slideshow, play from start. Hi everyone. Okay, I'm gonna stand here because I don't know my presentation super well, and I did print out some notes. Although maybe I'll try to pace around Eric's style if I get really animated. Hi, I'm Tyler Harlan, professor in urban and environmental studies, and it's really a pleasure to be here at the CBA. I spend most of my time in University Hall, and I was just saying to someone earlier, I don't know if I've left this week to come in the rest of campus, and every time I do, I'm like, our campus is so nice, why don't I just hang out over there all the time? That is where my office is, and I'm teaching there this semester. So, as you heard briefly, I research energy transitions and broader green transformations in China and Southeast Asia. But I'm also really interested in more conceptually the links between energy transition and biodiversity conservation. That's why I decided to join the panel, I think, and appreciate the invitation. And also, my presentation today is going to be reflected a little bit with that experience. So a kind of global scope, and also linking energy transition, also climate mitigation with biodiversity conservation. I do here want to talk about this more at a global scale. I've titled this Governing Biodiversity, Who Pays to Protect Nature. I could have also called it Financing Biodiversity. But governing and financing, though very different things, a big part of governing is who pays. And so that's a little bit what I want to talk about. I don't know if I'll talk specifically about LA, but I think there'll be some really nice linkages with what Eric was talking about. So let me start just with global governance. So this image is from the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, also known as the CBD. And this was in Montreal in 2022, so it wasn't that long. I didn't go to this personally, but I basically watched all of it online, and I had a couple of co-authors who went and we wrote a paper about this. So this was the COP15, as you can see that, it means it's the 15th meeting about the Convention on Biological Diversity at this global level since it was instituted in the early 90s. And so the CBD, I'm just going to call it the CBD, it's a global environmental agreement, and as the name suggests, it's mainly about protecting biodiversity. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the one you might have heard a little bit more about. And if you have ever heard of a COP at all, you might have heard of a 28, 29, or this year's 30. Those are climate COPs. Here we're talking about biodiversity COPs. By the way, if you want to know what it's like to go to a climate COP, ask Dr. Fitzpatrick.
And Tyler.
And me, we went together in Dubai. And so the climate COPs are way bigger than these. Way bigger, like almost an order of magnitude.
Extraordinary. Indescribable.
And there's a lot of biodiversity talk at the climate COP. This one is specifically about biodiversity. This agreement, the CBD, has 198 signatories. A signatory is a nation. And notably, the US is not one of them. The US has signed the UNFCCC, but not the CBD. And this meeting was especially important. That's why the image is up here. So at this meeting, the signatories or parties in this kind of governance terminology, they reached an agreement that's called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. That's because this COP15 was held in 2 parts. You can see it at the bottom, Kunming, Montreal. This replaced the previous targets, which were basically not met at all. Again, the analog here with the climate governance regime is the Paris Agreement on climate change. This is the Global Biodiversity, Convention on Biological Diversity's version of the Paris Agreement. It's called the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. It has 4 goals, it has 23 targets, and it has about 1 million metrics. I was thinking about metrics from Eric, your presentation earlier. And 2 of the most notable goals, one, maybe you've heard about this, is called the 30 by 30 goal. And the 30 by 30 means conserving 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030. And there's a group called the High Ambition Coalition that includes a lot of wealthier countries and also some populous countries that have signed up to this goal. They say, we're gonna deliver this. We're gonna set aside 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030 for conservation. That's not a goal that has yet been reached. We're in the kind of low 20s. There was also, importantly, and this gets to the financial aspect, there was a financial commitment to marshal $200 billion per year towards biodiversity in all types of finance, public, private, philanthropic, all adding up to about $200 billion. This is from a report that came out in 2020. It's from the Paulson Institute and the Nature Conservancy, think tank and NGO, and it's called the Biodiversity Financing Gap. It was a pretty influential report. Images are still being circulated from it a few years later. And so what it shows here, maybe I will pace a little bit. What it shows here is on the left, in 2019, this was published in 2020, the global biodiversity finance amounted to just under $150 billion per year. That's everything, and I'll show what everything means in a second. Okay, so that hasn't changed all that much. It's now about, it depends on how you count, but it's like about 165 billion. So it's about the same. What's needed, according to these report authors, is about upwards of 900 billion at the high level, 950 billion. At the lower level, it looks like closer to just about 700 billion. And that means the gap, the name of the report, and the term that now is being circulated quite a lot is the biodiversity financing gap. And so, from a moment ago, I said at the CBD, parties agreed to finance 200 billion per year. That means they've agreed to this. But the report authors are saying, we need that. And so, sure, we could quibble with methodology, we could ask what is meant by financing, what it goes to, and I'll do that in a moment. But I think the gap is striking nonetheless. Is that just like in our climate agreement, the climate agreement was momentous, very important. It gets everybody on the same page, and it provides pressure for countries to meet climate goals, and so does the GBF. But nevertheless, we're not meeting the financing gap. And so we do need to think about how we're going to marshal additional finance and what those financial models might look like. Again, like the Paris Agreement on climate change, the GBF is non-binding, which means that all you have is peer pressure and as much as you can incentives, but there's no stake. You can't do anything if a country doesn't abide by its agreements. And actually, each country will release a biodiversity strategy and action plan, the same name as what LA has released. And so here, there's governance at different levels. Eric was talking about at the urban sort of city level, and here we're just talking about globally and nation states. So here's where things stand now, and I kind of just want to talk about this slide for a second, and maybe I'll carry my notes with me. So this is what makes up the just under 150 billion biodiversity finance as of 2019. These numbers have changed slightly, but their percentages of each kind are about the same still. So I want to take you through this for a minute. Notice the biggest one is domestic budgets and tax policy. And so this is basically like government public funding for conservation. Things like conservation areas, national parks count as biodiversity conservation, wildlife protection, like something that Eric was talking about a moment ago. It also includes things like tax deductions and credits if you have, say, like a conservation easement on your property. Or if you do like a reforestation scheme, if you're a timber company, you might get a tax deduction or a credit. It also includes like taxes on, say, extractive industries or on like polluting or emitting industries that go towards conservation. So all of that around the world has been added up to being about 80 billion a year. By far the biggest chunk. Again, that's coming from public coffers, which means it's coming from tax dollars, right? And so there's calls, of course, for that to increase, but there are political limits to that too. There's also a big chunk here, 20% called natural infrastructure. This is also increasingly called nature-based solutions. I think that's been mentioned previously, and some of you might have heard that term. And these are things like, well, Eric was talking about it a moment ago, like wetlands that provide water purification, like mangroves that protect against storm surges. It includes, in an urban context, like green roofs, permeable pavement. All these are natural infrastructure. It could also be called nature-based solutions. That's a bit of an improvement there. And governments kind of typically allocate funds to these projects, or they might issue, and I'll talk about this in a moment, they might issue green bonds for them. But still, a lot of this is public funded. And so there's some overlap between those two. So we're still kind of looking at public finance here. The private sector has gotten a bit more involved, but mostly for projects that generate a financial return for obvious reasons. So if there's one takeaway point from these two, it's that it's public, it's government-led. And there are, again, limits to how much governments are going to spend on this. One more before I move on. See the orange there, official development assistance? That's like funds like the Global Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, loans, concessional loans from the World Bank, for example, and also just bilateral transfers from one country to another country, usually from the global north to the south, for specific biodiversity conservation projects. Lots more of this happening in the climate space, but it happens in the biodiversity space too. So that's a big chunk right now of what we're seeing with biodiversity finance. Philanthropic, super important, some big marquee projects, but only 1% of the global total. The rest, and I've got another slide for this, but the rest, things like offsets, I'll skip sustainable supply chains, green financial products, carbon markets. These are all the financial tools that analysts say we need to ramp up to meet that global biodiversity financing goal. Everything needs to be ramped up, but that is where the promise is. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll finish. I don't have a whole bunch of slides here. So these are often called market-based solutions, even if economists would probably quibble about whether they're markets or not. But that's often what they're called, so I'm just going to call them that too. Let me start with the classic one, and this one is Payments for Ecosystem Services, also known as PES. We just heard about ecosystem services. Thanks, Eric, for that great explanation. And so this is basically, it's simple enough. It involves users of a resource, or in more complex terms, beneficiaries of an ecosystem service. It involves them compensating the people who maintain or enhance or restore those ecosystem services. That's the idea conceptually. If you ever see an image of how this works in practice, it's always a river. And it is downstream users that use water and want purified water that's clean and healthy, paying upstream farmers and resource managers to protect the soil an ecosystem at the headwaters of that river. But you can do it for other things too. You can even do it for global climate. So you can pay others to plant trees or protect forests so that it sequesters carbon. Therefore, we benefit from the ecosystem service of less climate change. So same idea. Biodiversity offsets are a bit different. Again, you can see I'm interested in the carbon biodiversity connection, so I keep coming back to carbon. This has happened in carbon, in climate change carbon for a long time. But biodiversity offsets, just to explain briefly, they're a bit like the flip side of PES. Okay, so instead of paying the protectors of a resource, the users paying the protectors, what happens is that usually a company will fund a conservation or a restoration project that offsets biodiversity loss that they have caused themselves. And so, for example, there might be a mining or an infrastructure project that destroys habitats in there. And that mining or infrastructure company has to finance wetland restoration somewhere else to make up for it. Now, the company probably doesn't know how to do that. And so what they actually do is they purchase what's called a biodiversity credit. And it may be from a compliance market, like a market that's set up legally, like the US wetland banking. They might purchase a credit from there. And then a special restoration NGO or contractor will do this for them, right? So they actually just purchase a credit. So you're starting to see how these are like kind of financial tools. Carbon offsets work very similarly for companies that emit a lot of carbon. They can purchase a credit for a project that sequesters carbon elsewhere or mitigates. Okay, so getting to slightly more complicated. I think I've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to move quickly and I'll probably skip the next slide because I want to. Offsets are pretty related to the third, which I've talked about nature-based solutions, so I just want to talk about the second part, carbon markets. So offsets are very related to these. We have a carbon market in California, the California Cap and Trade Scheme. The EU has one, and China has one. The way these markets work is they cap emissions at a certain level, and then if you need to purchase more credits so that you can emit more if you're a company, you can purchase them on an open market, and the price of carbon is set by supply. This is important for biodiversity because some of these carbon markets also allow for carbon offsets. Okay, and carbon offsets include a whole variety of projects, many of which also are included as biodiversity conservation. Okay. The last three are a little bit more new terrain. And so these are the things that green finance boosters really hope will sort of carry a lot of the load to fill that biodiversity financing gap. So let me briefly talk about each of them. Let me really briefly. So green bonds, I mentioned them earlier. These are financial instruments specifically to issued to raise capital for projects that have positive environmental benefits. They're similar to traditional bonds, but the proceeds from them have to be used for green projects. Again, things like wetland restoration and green spaces in urban contexts, but also things that are, you could more easily see the profit potential in them, like sustainable forestry, sustainable agriculture, and energy systems. Green bonds can be issued in the private sector. They can also be issued by public sector entities like cities and states. Blended finance is another really big category. I can talk about this more in the Q&A. It basically involves blending public and philanthropic investment, that kind of stuff that already exists and takes up the majority of that yield. Blending that with private sector investment. And the idea, and maybe you've heard this term before, is to unlock private capital by de-risking it and making projects more attractive to private investors. And so I think this specifically, finally getting into something really relevant to a lot of folks here, I think, especially those of you who are studying finance, is that These are ways to de-risk some of those investments so that it makes it more attractive to private capital. I've got an example here. I think I'll move on from it, but there are various examples of kind of facilities or funds that seek very specifically to do this and to incentivize private capital. Actually, the example I was going to mention is in Indonesia, where oil palm plantation private firms can be incentivized through public investment to change some of their land use practices and make them more sustainable. And so to kind of redirect some of their investment to, and also attract more investment into sustainable palm oil production. And then finally, nature-based asset classes. I think I'm almost over time, but let me just say quickly that these involve, and I can talk about them in the Q&A, nature-linked derivatives, where you can trade credits on a market, and you can bet on the future value of them. And it also includes things very relevant to folks here, again, like impact investing funds. Funds that are specifically targeting low carbon projects and biodiversity conservation projects, excuse me. These are where there's a lot of growth potential. But there's lots and lots of issues with using public finance to unlock private capital, and a lot of issues too about greenwashing in this space. And so I'm going to skip this slide here and just kind of leave this here for a moment and just say, financial tools are important, right? But biodiversity conservation is not just about money, it's also about power. It's about who's got the power to make decisions about what to fund, and who has the power to shape biodiversity governance globally and locally. And so finance is important for sure, but it's not the only thing. And if we fill the finance gap, that's fantastic, but that's not enough. We need to also be clear about who's got the power. Current models kind of prioritize economic returns. Those are the ones that are getting the most traction. Can economic return generate positive biodiversity benefits? I think in many cases it can, but that is an open question maybe for later. There's a need to ensure that those people who are safeguarding biodiversity for the rest of the world, that their rights are also safeguarded and they're leading these efforts. And then I'll leave a big question there. Do we need to price nature at all, or is a different approach even possible? All right, I'll stop there.
So, good evening. As you can see, my name, what? I forgot my name. Those other guys thought of that. I usually didn't have big and bold, so anyway. Galbraith, our chair on ethics, right? So, how many of you are business students? How many are not business students? So, what do you guys do? Okay, perfect. So, we've got a little bit of everything. So, we've got a panel that mixes it up, and I having these colleagues, we're talk a lot with the Institute of Business Ethics and Sustainability, and we talked about doing this thing on biodiversity. I said that sounds like a good idea, and suddenly I'm in front of you guys, and I'm like, what do I know about this? Well, let's see. So even though I made a bunch of slides, I probably won't get through all of them. But what I wanted to talk about was something that's not even my slides. I just kind of thought about this. So. Obviously, our dean knows that part of our mission of the College of Business is to be a force for good, right? Business. But if we think about business, we probably would say business is to blame for a fair amount of things, although we're all humans, right? So humans. So one thing I taught recently was Stoicism, which Liz is very familiar with, and I was thinking about this idea of control. Things we can control and things we can't control. And if we think about humans, we've always tried to control things. If you think about business, we've tried to control everything, right? And we try to control nature. And if nature gets in our way, we'll just get rid of it. There's more where that came from, except now there isn't, right? And so we've sort of figured out maybe that model's not going to work, and when we're going to be thinking about business for good, we've got to be part of the solution. We can't solve everything, but we're gonna have to partner with governments and NGOs and other things to fix this stuff. And power is a good word. I'm a subject of power is very intriguing to me for everything because power does solve a lot of things. So here we go. We'll figure it out. I don't want to keep you too long because I want to have your questions. So a couple definitions of biodiversity that I've found recently, and one I want to focus on. So when I want to highlight something, I put it in good old LMU blue here. So provides a wealth of essential goods, not least food, et cetera, also provides services for society, insects, birds, and animals, pollinate, right? So those are the things that we try to get rid of or kill or whatever if they got in our way, because we like to control things. We like to make things very dependable. And this is, you know, this might resonate with us when we come up, when we see a hummingbird. We have a lot of hummingbirds in our yard and so on. But as a business, that's just something that gets in the way. So we're trying to, again, recognize that that's not going to work. So we now recognize that things like the population of pollinators, such as bees, is on the decline. Whoops, we need bees. And we were destroying those bees. Wildlife habitats increase. So we have all this stuff we're recognizing that, you know, if you're Coca-Cola, what do you sell? Well, actually, you don't. You sell to the you sell syrup to the bottlers, so they're a separate company. I didn't know that for a long time. But what do the bottlers need to use with the syrup? Water, right? Oh, do we have enough water? So there have been cases where they've started to build factories to, you know, manufacture these bottles of water and ship them a long ways, which costs a lot of money and so on. And they recognize, gee, if we don't have enough water. So all these things are coming to bear where can we actually do these things? So I'm going to get big picture here for a minute. What do businesses do, and why do they do it, and what do they report on? Because in a sense, that tells us what is going to happen. And I'll give you the end result here. Is we're not doing much in terms of measuring biodiversity at this point, but we're getting there. We're kind of getting there. So corporate data collection. So whether it be about sustainability, biodiversity, or whatever, if you want us to report on it, we have to find a way to collect it, and we have to be a reason. Maybe there's power. Who decides what we're going to collect and why we're going to collect it? There's collections for compliance or to provide information for stakeholders. So who are some stakeholders of businesses? We're all stakeholders because we're probably consumers, we're employees, we might be vendors, we might be shareholders, all of those things. And so when we decide as a business that we are going to actually collect information, we're going to take certain actions. Some of these will be regulatory or contractual, that is compliance. Hard law, we're required to have an audit, we're required to report these things. Some of them may be contractual because there's a difference between private and public. So what we disclose to the public might be different than what we would disclose to a vendor that we have a contract with, a consumer, or whatever it might be. There are also voluntary things that we might disclose. And the reason I'm talking about voluntary is because sustainability reports are for the most part voluntary, especially in the United States. Now that's changing a bit. The SEC was going to require certain things about carbon and other emissions, which is probably not going to happen, you know. And we don't need to get into that, but there's still a lot of places in the world. Some of these are either required or maybe voluntary. So we have external and internal reporting. And when we think about what actions we're going to take and what metrics we're going to actually measure, all of this has costs. So when we do things, it costs something to do those things. Why do we do those things? If we're going to collect things or we're going to do things, we have to figure out how are we going to do these, and all of us, including everybody in this audience, we make decisions based on different alternatives that we have. And we have, at least I don't know about you, but most of us don't have all the money that we have. So companies may say, well, you know, being sustainable or being this or being that costs money, or how are we going to measure that, and what are we going to measure, who's going to tell us what to measure? And so there's all these costs of collecting all of these things. When we talk about sustainability, I'm using two major standard setters, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has been around, about 5 minutes. They have come about by a lot of rolling up of all these other organizations. Probably been 15 or 20 organizations over the last 15, 20 years that are saying, we're gonna set the standards. Now, actually, one that I don't have up here is SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which went out and said, you know where we might be able to get some money and get some traction is investors actually want to know about sustainability. Because they're such good people? No, because they want to know what is the impact of not having enough water? What is the impact of not having bees or whatever it might be on your business, which means I need to understand that to be able to invest in you. So this traction was, where's the money? The money wants to know about the investors. Well, remember, there's a lot of other stakeholders like us. We may not get that information that we want, but those investors are starting to get that information. There's also the GRI has been around a long time. If you look at a sustainability report or an ESG report of a company, you'll often see a number of different standards that they might use, including the UN SDGs. And so it's kind of a hodgepodge of things. The other thing, just going back to reports, many of you in business, if you haven't already, you've taken at least the financial accounting course, right? And what do we know about that? It gets audited. So are these numbers audited? If we go 100 years ago, financial reporting, who knew what the measures were? Auditing, we didn't know what to audit. You know, we'd have a list of inventory, we'd add it up. Hey, we're done, we audited that. So now the question is, when we're reporting these different numbers, can we really rely on them? We haven't gotten biodiversity yet, so we have all these measures. So what are some environmental measures? My friends from not the CBA here today are very interested in environmental metrics, but in terms of sustainability reports, we see some of these things which have become important, but we have other sustainability reports, like what's going on with social, employee well-being, community impact, human rights. What about governance, board diversity, ethical practices, transparency? Well, the corporate governance will also play into what we're willing to report or what we're willing to do for the environmental side as well. So I found an interesting report, Global Risk Report 2025, trying to get up to date on everything. I think it's 2025, isn't it? Okay, so this is pretty interesting. It's these interconnections, and you may not be able to see it. I've got the arrow, it's on biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Even though we're in business just starting to get some measures here, we're already looking at measures that are related to these and have impact on them anyway, and we can see everything. This is the beauty of how I can never get my research done, because I think everything relates to everything. I can never kind of focus on one thing. But we see all these interconnections, including this thing that we're talking about today, biodiversity loss. Also, what are the global risks? This was a survey done. For the next 2 years, notice where biodiversity loss is. It's not even there. But when we ask people, what do you think are going to be the biggest global risks in 10 years? Wow, biodiversity pops up to number 2. And so people are recognizing, and we're starting to figure out, how do we measure these types of things? You know, whether it be scientific or whether it be from the business perspective, what are we going to do? So in terms of nature risk, we've got tremendous nature risk that we're now recognizing as businesses. Whether or not we're trying to be a force for good or not, we're trying to be a force to make sure our companies stay around and can produce goods and services for our customers. So there may be disruption of operations. That's not a good thing, no matter what it might be. So climate change is certainly doing those things where we have storms and other things, but we're going to be focusing on where can we get into biodiversity measures. So we have market risk, litigation risk, reputational risk. You know, if we destroy the bees, people are not going to be happy, they're not going to like us, and we have all kinds of other risks. If we look at the top 10 biodiversity impact rankings, and I won't go into all these, but food, beverage, and tobacco is the biggest, and materials, and then energy and some other things. We see similarly here, fishery and aquaculture, forestry, food, beverage, tobaccos, which is similar to the last one, agriculture, construction. Those are where we see many of the things that are being very impacted in some other industries, not as much right now anyway. So in terms of these measures, what are we going to measure? Well, reporting the damage done to the natural world isn't the same as stopping it. So even if we come up with measures, that's not really what we're trying to get done. We're trying to say, how do we improve these things? How do we make a change for the better? If you look at many of these sustainability measures, we're saying, here's a goal. Here's how we're going towards that goal. We don't have that set for diversity or biodiversity quite yet. What are some strategies? Again, we got to recognize that it's our problem as well as everyone else's. We have to make sure that we include that in our disclosures, which means we have to come up with measures. We also have, like everything else, if we don't focus on everything that we have to do. So for example, we say, here's financial reporting and here is sustainability reporting, biodiversity reporting. Oh, everybody is, in charge of making sure we make our financial, and now we have a few people over here with sustainability. It's not going to work that way. We have to have a culture of looking at these things as being important. Also, as I mentioned, we need third-party certifications to benchmark and then evaluate these practices that we have with the metrics that we have. So even if we start to measure them, how do we know that those measures are accurate or good? And what are the benchmarks? What are the common things that we might see? So what can the private sector do? Reduce land footprints, reduce chemical use, eliminate toxic waste systems, contribute to ecosystem restoration, circular solutions, biodiversity-friendly organizational culture, so that we're all on board doing those things. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, is one of these new organizations that's coming up with some of these disclosures and measures. They're consistent with what the TCFD and the ISSB, which I just mentioned before, are doing. So we see a whole hodgepodge of these different groups trying to work towards the same goals. And we see a lot of rolling up, so the ISSB has become very important as it relates to sustainability in general. And here we have Unilever, who is one of the first companies that says, hey, I'm with you here. And here we are a number of years later, and they're saying, oh, we're developing stuff. They don't even have their measures together yet. I am happy to report, and I'll be done in about 2 minutes, so we can get some questions and answers, I hope, is that one of the companies that is on our advisory board for the IBES, L'Oreal, has actually been reporting some things, so let me scoot through to there. If you look at TNF, though, I'm going to look at a couple things, like we have, one of the things I think is important to see is that we measure changes. So how are we improving things? If we have measures, we want to say, where are we trying to go, and how far are we towards getting that? We're doing that in a lot of these sustainability measures. We don't have the biodiversity measures yet. Oh, and I also wanted to mention this. This was way back on March 13th of 2025. It was in the LA Times. It was pretty interesting, really. If you look at Corn is Mexico, it's not just the biodiversity, but what is that to the culture, to indigenous people or others who say, you know, this has been important to us for decades or centuries or millennial or whatever it might be. So what are these things that we're doing when we have corn, for example? And companies say you have to buy this type of corn. We've got GMO, you know, all this other kind of stuff that is important to biodiversity. So here we're just talking about corn, which is important to Mexico. But here's L'Oreal. They're recognizing the things that they're trying to do. Here we have very commonly, Tyler mentioned this in the big picture, you know, we're setting targets for different years. Sometimes they're getting moved out farther and farther. Sometimes we're not making a lot of progress. So we do see them looking at some of these things, using green sciences as they're doing these things. You know, some of these things we have to be very careful because we want to know, are these greenwashing? On the other hand, some of us, I know Jeff and I talked about the other day, there's now a term green hushing because it's not popular to be reporting on ESG and sustainability now. So actually corporations are being quiet about it because they can get in trouble if they're doing these kinds of things, which is not going to be helpful at all. So we do see L'Oreal trying to come up with how are they dealing with things like not any more deforestation on the vendors that they're working with and companies they're working with, the sources that they're working with. And so quick overview of the kinds of things we need to work on that biodiversity stuff, but thank you for my colleague being here today. I'd like to hear from you.
So let's take a few minutes for questions as our panelists have a seat. Questions, thoughts, observations? Yes, Dean Smith.
You know, this was fascinating. I learned a lot about biodiversity. It took me back to my days as an undergraduate student where, you know, I had to take a biology class and these things were talked about then, and I find myself many, many years later now connecting the dots. It took a while. And here's my concern. We learn about these things. Scientific research talks about why it's so important to pay attention to things that we may not pay attention to in general in society. And then you have all of these geopolitical pressures, and you have the change of administrations, not just here in the US, but abroad, all of the change in political systems. And it seems like every time there's a new political party in power, the emphasis changes. So how do you become proactive? I mean, here we are at a school, regardless of what college you're from, where we're learning the kinds of things that say these things are connected, and if we're not serious about this, we won't have a planet left. I mean, that's what I take away from all of this, is there will not be a planet left for my grandchildren. And God knows for these grandchildren of the younger people in the group. So what can we do once we connect these dots? How do we get the people in power, to use Harlan's word, how do we get the people in power to start connecting the dots and recognizing that short-term solutions that create long-term consequences spell the death of the planet?
Well, I would pick up that's a very complicated and imposing question. But I would say that the role for science is to continue to gather information. If the information isn't there and it's not dependable, then when the motivation for change and the motivation for transformation is in place, we won't necessarily know where to go. And ecological biodiversity information is so central. I mean, ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, house. It's really an understanding of ourselves embedded in the system. And by engaging these questions across disciplinary boundaries, we create, I think, safe places for these conversations to take place. And just as we're all in our own research realm saying, okay, under the new federal guidelines for research, certain things are governmentally unpopular, but they're embedded in things that are critically important to everyone. And so there are ways to move forward, even in times that don't feel progressive for whatever particular issue you feel is being constrained. And I think universities play a critically important role in that, and I think in preparing our students to be future scholars and recognize they're going to have a 70-year professional lifespan at least. You know, they will see these changes come and go.
You know, Larry, to pick up on that, I think, so biodiversity conservation, as Larry, you mentioned too in the slides, it is not as prominent as climate mitigation at all. It plays second fiddle, and it's one of the first things to drop off in, I'm sure, corporate sustainability also in global environmental governance in general. So much attention is focused on the climate change negotiations and almost none on the biodiversity negotiations. And so part of it, you were mentioning, is how do we get those empowered to connect the dots to know that this is important. So a couple of things I was thinking about is this is starting to happen both in the biodiversity COP space, but also amongst climate folks, knowing that biodiversity and climate are intimately related. And so there's a lot of not just talk, but actual discussion about finance being marshaled at the climate negotiations, not just the biodiversity ones. I think it's also, in a way, I mean, there's always more to be done. It's also heartening, I think, if we can examine these global governance structures and see that there is momentum behind them, and that there is progress being made, and that nations, partners and nations, are seeking to reach these targets that they've negotiated in good faith. They're never enough, but there's that kind of momentum. And probably even more importantly is that there's momentum outside of the US context or even a public sector context of the private sector prioritizing this and been prioritizing climate for a long time, prioritizing sustainability in general. And in many ways, that train has kind of left the station, and it's not coming back. And so, whatever the administration might do, the private sector, and there might be some green hushing, so it might be like that for the period of time. But at the same time, there's all this investment going into renewable energy, there's all this investment in natural infrastructure, and that is not going to stop because it's getting cheaper and there's momentum.
Well, the reason there's green hushing is because they're still doing things. So we look at corporations, even if the SEC doesn't require disclosures, California requires disclosures, the European Union requires disclosures. So I think, along with what Tyler and Eric are saying, is the train has left the station. We probably need to be going much faster on that train. Yet there's still people on the train, still people pushing the train, whatever metaphors we want to use. And I think education is extremely important, and the ability to continue to have dialogue, to do research, and maybe in some cases to be more vocal. I mean, it doesn't really do much, but I have a resist sign in my front yard for a week now.
Just we'll wait,
Yeah,
the wind was so
I did have to unravel it this morning. But we have to voice what we do in many different ways, including voting.
I just want to thank the three of you from a perspective of so often our majors within schools and then across schools operate sometimes in silos. And what was so clear about your three presentations is the value of that interconnectivity in those conversations, that business needs science, science needs business, and you really saw that come alive in what the three of you shared. So I just want to say thank you. I've got new ways to talk about it at the Innovation Symposium on Friday, so thank you for that.
Well, before we leave this, let me offer just a nexus that Tyler made reference to, that biodiversity takes the backseat to climate. And I say that research is going to change that, because let's talk about one of the great biodiversity successes in North America, and that's the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. But in fact, the most profound impact is that the presence of the wolves changes the behavior of the herbivores, which is allowing the woodlands to restore. And it's a natural carbon sequestration accelerator that we wouldn't have predicted if we didn't do the research. Because the wolves are not directly eating the plants or have anything to do with the plants, but they're changing profoundly through the ecology of theater the behavior of the animals that are wrecking the vegetative communities. And so there's been this wonderful green transformation.
Didn't that also affect the watershed as well?
Well, sure, because it increases the water quality, it changes the way that water is retained, it changes the nature of the soils.
Hi there. Thank you again so much for presenting, because I'm very passionate about this stuff, and I have sort of a two-part question. So, I love, sometimes when I'm feeling down or something, I love to watch a good dystopian movie. And speaking of trains, look at Snowpiercer, which is actually interesting because it's an overreaction to climate change. The world freezes over, and the whole ecosystem of the train goes around the world. Anyways, how can we demonstrate the financial viability of protecting endangered species? I know every species technically has an impact on certain ecosystems in the environment, but I'm talking about some very threatened species where even some of their populations are down to in dozens, right? And that, as you're saying about the hummingbirds, certain species take over time, and yes, that happens. But like, I also really find it amazing, like, when I hear about species going extinct or something, it's just like, oh, come on, it was just here one day, it's been here for millions of years, and now it's gone for good. And that to me is like kind of depressing. So how can we demonstrate that financial viability to say even like these smallest of populations of species are worth protecting? And two, what about the advancements of possibilities of de-extinction? And I'm talking about the quack, the elephant bird, the mammoth, the Baiji river dog, even the damn dodo, right? People want to revive them. We have some of that genetic material that's left over. Not going to be the exact original species, but just that promise of species that used to dominate certain ecosystems to come back, and how that can actually shape the world going ahead.
Yeah, very Jurassic Park about that.
Yeah,
Bringing them
probably happen.
Yeah, let me just start by offering the idea that I was an environmental regulator in Massachusetts for quite some time, as well as being a field biologist. And one of the interesting transformations has been the tremendous drop in the number of hunting licenses and fishing licenses that the state was selling. And it's through those licenses that the capital was available to protect the lands, because people are changing from consumptive experiences with nature to observational experiences with nature. And if you think about the most endangered species in the most remote areas, they are the amount of tourist dollars that are generated for people to go and see and to learn about these relationships to nature. And humans are redefining the sacred. And in some ways, this reemergence of traditional ecological knowledge, our recognition of the power of indigenous methods of managing ecosystems, is attracting, especially your generation, to the kind of consumptive experiences that don't require a hook and bullet. And look, I'm not against hunting and fishing sports, but I'm just saying it's a different model. And so that brings endangered species into the conversation because they can be observed without direct consumption. Not without challenges, we know what whale watches do and things like that, but it brings in enormous capacity. From Cape Cod, it transformed the economy of Cape Cod when the whale watch industry, because those people going there, it's not just riding in the whale boat, it's the restaurant, it's the stores, it's the hotels, it's all of that goes with it, that becomes the lifeblood of a particular area. It's no longer catching the fish, it's watching nature. And think of what's happening in East Africa with non-consumptive safaris. These are very, very powerful economic transformers that are the result of recognition of endangered species.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I wonder if I could just ask a couple of observations and maybe your observations. So, on the one hand, part of what tonight has been a deep dive on one dimension, biodiversity, of a reality that's an integrated and nested set of systems. And so we are taking apart a segment to understand it more deeply, but also needing to affirm that everything is interconnected, and we need to think in terms of wholeness at the same time that we're trying to make progress in understanding and in responsiveness to a dimension of that wholeness. That's one piece. And another thing that struck me in the last question is there is sometimes a desire towards stasis, and yet you gave, Eric, that resilience idea that fundamentally said there is a kind of never-ending momentum of change. And so how do we think of wholeness, and how do we think of a capacity to be adaptive and engaging with inevitable change if these are dimensions of what we're talking about, both in the area of biodiversity and overall?
The
got too philosophical.
I want to hear from you two because I don't know.
I might take a stab at it, but it might have to be inflected with my own research. So, there's clearly a lot of positive benefits globally and local context to biodiversity conservation. There's clearly, I think, in a lot of cases, a financial case for protecting biodiversity. There's also a long-running association between, biodiversity conservation and poverty reduction and economic development.
Yes.
And so when I was talking about payments for ecosystem services, that's the original sort of biodiversity finance model, but that has been implemented mainly in the global south.
Yeah, reprotected areas, for instance.
Right. And so the idea being that those protectors of that resource are those who are more marginalized and poorer than generally urban residents. And so thinking about systems, we're not just even talking about the relationship between, say, climate and biodiversity, but also the relationship between environmental systems and social systems. And in this case, there's conceptually a win-win here in conserving biodiversity and promoting poverty reduction. There's also cases where relying too much on financial models for biodiversity conservation prioritizes profit-making at the expense of a more equitable distribution of benefits. So I think building on your question, I think we need to keep in mind that everything is related in this holistic way, and that we also do need to prioritize the social benefits.
So I think the interconnectedness is so important. So, and the research on this comes from so many different ways. So Dean Smith and I were at a faculty thing that was not very large, it was this past Friday, and we had a marketing professor looking at how businesses connect together, why they're close together. And he was focused not on why they're focused, why do they do that from a business perspective, but just which businesses are next to each other, and which comes first or which is the other, and saw these big connections. So his example was, people say, why is there a food desert? Why don't you just put a grocery store there? Well, his research suggests that when there's a grocery store, there's something else that sometimes the grocery store is drawn to these other businesses or vice versa. So if we don't understand that relationship, we don't solve other problems. So it's really systemic and interconnected. And we find out about those connections in various ways in which we research, not just when we're environmental scientists, but when we're marketing professors or accounting professors. We say, that's interesting, and ask why, and what can that tell us in terms of, underrepresented groups, low-income areas. Why are these things not there? It's not just because somebody didn't invest and put a store there, because sometimes that happens and it doesn't work. But why? Why didn't it work? So I think that these conversations really are helpful to make those connections that we wouldn't have otherwise thought about.
And the food desert piece is so interesting because part of that research relies on what we think healthy food has to be sold from. And just in the same way, delivering services to the global south doesn't look like copper wires anymore. Delivering nutritious food into underserved neighborhoods doesn't have to be a 50,000-foot grocery store, because it isn't the way a lot of people are consuming. And just like we're using much less farmland than we used to because of our changes in farming practice, 500 million acres going back to nature, because they're really not needed, even though we're growing more food. I mean, the solutions are so interdigitated, and the players you bring up, it's critical that this iterative process be considered.
So it's 7. Thank you so very much, Dr. Strauss, Dr. Harlan, Dr. Calabrese. Was there something else?
No, I'm just thanking the group for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, you guys, and thank you for hanging in there. And there's food outside. We can continue the conversation outside. What an honor. Thank you so much.